with us. And like I said, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for participating. We have a very common interest, I think, all of us in Munising history and this amazing story that is set during a very interesting time in our town's history, something that we're all reliving at the moment. So I would like to kind of give you a rundown of how we're going to work this meeting, because we do have a number of participants and I suspect we'll be adding a few more in throughout. So down on the bottom of your screen, you have a chat option. And the chat box is where we are going to, does everybody know where the chat is down on your bottom of your screen? The chat box is going to be used for questions. So how we'll do this is Michael has a presentation and then I'll share that screen and we'll show you the presentation. He's going to talk about the book and you know, really how he came to write this story, which is what we're all here to hear about anyway. So when he's done, we're gonna run through questions that you have in the chat, and then at the end of it, we'll open it up for more conversation. So the way I'd like you to do this is in the Zoom chat, if you have a question for Michael that you'd like to ask him about the book or about his grandmother or any other questions, I'd like you to start that question with a Q, just letter Q, and then write that so that we know that that's a question and not just a comment. We'll try to get to everybody's questions. I think that's a little bit more efficient way. That way we don't have a lot of people asking the same questions if you see your question already there. So if you have anything further, then we can probably open that up afterwards. So I'm going to turn this over to Michael Stone. I'm absolutely thrilled that he's here with us. We talked about this, what, about a year and a half ago, Michael?
Year and a half ago when the book came out, yeah.
He called me up and said, I have a book I think you'd be interested in. And I don't know how my reaction came across to you, but I thought I was pretty exuberant.
You were, yes.
And
been one of the biggest supporters of the book.
So we are going to be promoting also the Pandemic History Walk, which we're doing hand in hand with the promotion of Michael's book for the library. And so if you are in the area and you have the opportunity between now and the 10th of November, please take some time to go and socially distance yourself and go on the self-guided Pandemic History Walk. Our Gales of November came a little early, and we did lose 2 signs to the bay. So those are being reprinted, and they'll be put out probably by tomorrow. But that's okay. I'll show those 2 to you tonight. That was the one of the Beach Inn and the First National Bank. So those will be replaced. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Michael, and I'm going to make this. Let's see, it should go to a speaker view. So go.
Well, while you're getting the slideshow up, let me just say, definitely check the Pandemic History Walk out if you haven't already. Lisa previewed the signs for me when we met last week, and they're really amazing. So, I want to start off with a thank you to Lisa for arranging tonight's event. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Lisa, and this history walk, really as the author and then as the people who actually live where this occurred, it really brings it to life. So I can't encourage you enough to get out there and see that. It's very special.
Okay, I'm going to try and get to presentation. So hang on just a second.
Okay.
And we're going to share our screen. Okay, does everybody see that?
Yeah, I can see it. I don't know if everybody else can.
Okay.
Okay, you can go ahead and go to the first slide, please. So I wanted to start off with a thank you to Lisa, a thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Lisa and I have been talking about this for a long time. I've been working on this book for a long time, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. I came to Munising for the first time back in 1997, 23 years ago, to do the original research. And that was so long ago. Lisa, since she took over at the library, has put all of the historical documents on digital. And back when I did it, they were on microfilm. So I was in the library for about a week, scrolling through the microfilm, to find all of the articles in the Munising News. And we didn't have a laptop back then. My sister came with me. And so I'm writing everything down. She's reading it to me. We probably were in that library for a good 5 or 6 days. So that was when I did the majority of the research. And the majority of the stuff I'm going to show you tonight comes from articles from the Munising News, which was published weekly back then. It came out on Fridays. Another big source for all of this was a book called Alger County, A Centennial History. Is that something they have in the library, Lisa?
Yes.
Yeah, that book has extensive information about Munising. So if there's anything more that you want to learn after tonight, you should definitely check that out. And then thirdly, we were at the Historical Society when we came to visit, and Faye Swanberg worked there back then. And she said, I've got to take you to someone's house and you've got to talk to her. So she took me over to Brynhild Oas, is it, Lisa? To Brynhild Oas. And my sister and I sat and talked with her for about a half hour, and she remembered all kinds of things about my grandmother, about Munising back in the day. One of the details I was telling Lisa, one of the details that I got was the detail about the buckets being at the end of the hall, the water buckets, and the boys would go down to a nearby stream, bring those up, and of course those had to be taken away during the pandemic. But that was an example of one of the details I got from an actual person in Munising that I would have had no way of knowing. So that was pretty exciting. So Lisa and I, one of the first things we also shared was that her grandmother was 10 years old, Lisa?
Yeah, 10 or 11.
10 or 11 at the time of the pandemic in 1918, and actually had to leave her home to be quarantined. And so we're presuming that at some point she and my grandmother met, and my grandmother even possibly took care of her. So there's all kinds of stories in the town, and I hope at the end, if anybody has any personal connections or other personal stories, they would feel free to share those with us. I think that'd be pretty interesting. So let's go to the next slide.
Let me see here. I had to admit somebody into the room.
Oh, sure. Take your time.
And now I'm not sure if it's going to let me go to the next. There we go.
There we go. So this is Lucile Ball, not the one that you've heard about on film and TV. This is my grandmother, Lucile Ball. This is the earliest picture we have of her. She was born in November of 1896. We're coming up on her 124th birthday in about 2 weeks. Obviously, this picture is still kind of from the Victorian era. They've got her perched on this giant fur rug or whatever that is. But this is the earliest picture that we have. So she was born just before the turn of the century. I personally have found that time very fascinating. There's so many things that were changing then, and it turns out that this was a very fascinating period of time in Munising as well. If you could go to the next slide, Lisa. So Munising was founded in 1895. Many of you probably know that. It was founded by a gentleman named Timothy Nestor, who then became the first village president in June of 1896. That's when the town was incorporated. What I think is interesting is that my grandmother and Munising were approximately the same age, in their early 20s, when she arrived. So that is one of the interesting coincidences. Let's go to the next slide, Lisa. Thanks. So what happened as I started researching the book is and got to know Munising and the people that lived there through the newspaper. I really realized that Munising was going to be and did become kind of another character in the book. And that's really how I approached it as I wrote the book. The bulk of the book takes place in Munising. And it really had the feel of a Western frontier town to me. This city built up very quickly. It was founded in 1896, and by 1918, it had one of its highest populations historically. The population peaked in that 1918 to 1920 area between 5,000 and 6,000 people. So if you look at picture 1 on this slide, Munising, as you all know, was born a mill town. At the point that my grandmother arrived in 1918, it was booming. It was at its peak of production. There were 22 to 26 mills surrounding Munising Bay, which Munising Bay is large, but that sounds like a lot of mills to me. They made lumber, they made shingles, they made barrel staves, which were the little strips of wood that you actually make the barrels out of. And then they had cooperages, they're called, which I had to look up. That's where the barrels were actually made. So that's where they put the rings to hold the staves together. There were 350-foot trams or docks that extended out into Munising Bay. Now, I don't know if some of these mills shared those docks or if each mill had its own, but there would have been multiple very long docks extending out into the bay, into the deep water where the boats could come and take the lumber away. So I'm sure it was quite a sight. And we know for sure that there were several of them at the end of Elm Street, next to where the Beach Inn was, and I think where the city dock or the city park is. Lisa, is that what's going on? So then if you look at, so number picture shows the industry. Lisa tells me that in the background there is a paper mill, but there, you know, it was a very booming time for the city. So picture 2 shows a downtown scene. I believe this is on Superior Street. And from the look of the way people are dressed, I think it is right around this time that we're talking about. So Munising was vibrant, it was booming, it had its largest population, and everything was geared around the mills, the way I picture it, and supporting the mills. These mills were operating 24/7, and they had lots of men there that came just to work at the mills. So one of the big things in Munising were saloons. And there were 20 saloons in the city at that point, and they were open from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. every day, I assume to sort of support the different shifts of workers. And then there were also many boarding houses where these workers lived and some single room occupancy hotels. So there were a lot of single guys, a lot of these saloons, and I think it was probably a pretty interesting place. I think with the mills, there was also a lot of money, which I don't think was always the case back then in these towns. Munising had a modern hospital at this point. It was built in 1910, and it had a modern operating room, and it was 3 stories tall, and the nurses lived right in the hospital on the 3rd story. They had a brand new theater, the Delft Theater, which is referred to in the book. It was built in 1915 and had 624 seats, which I think was pretty large. Munising had 2 roller skating rinks. Bicycles were very popular. Cars were just starting to come, but bicycles were the main mode of transportation, I think, and horses, obviously. I mentioned the bicycles, though, because I think a lot of the mill workers went back and forth to their jobs on bike. And so they were allowed to ride on the sidewalks 3 times a day, kind of during these times that would have been commuting times. So from 5:30 to 7 a.m., from noon to 1 p.m., and again from 5 to 7 p.m. And the law was that they had to have lights, they had to have brakes, and they had to have a beller horn that functioned. Now in this picture, you can see the sidewalks were pretty wide, and they were made of wood at the time because the streets were dirt and were prone to flooding. There was a fire bell that rang at 10 p.m. every night. They had a curfew in town, so the fire bell would ring throughout the town to tell the kids that it was time to go home. There was a police officer that patrolled the city all night and all day. If there was an emergency at this point, telephones were up and running. They would place a call to an operator if you needed help, and the operator had a light switch by her switchboard, and she'd flip on a red light that lived on top of the Marx building. Now the Marx building is still there. It's Superior and Elm. There's still some signage on the side of it that says that it's the Marx building and what they sold back then. So there was this light on top of it that would light up. And then the police officer also had a phone in his little hut that he took shelter in, and he could call the operator to find out where the emergency was. So not super efficient, but pretty cool. The light was there on the building, if anybody remembers, according to my research, until 1962 was when that got turned off. Other things that they did in town, there were dances at St. Martin's Barn, which Lisa tells me was up on a high hill. And they had sewing and knitting circles for the women, and they did a lot of tobogganing down Lenox Hill, which Lisa tells me was on Jewel Street. Now, a lot of my research came from these 6 or 7 3 to 5 page essays that my grandmother wrote as an older woman, where she reflected back on her life and wrote down some of the stories from her life. And so in those, when she referenced Munising, she talked about visiting waterfalls, and she talked about skating out onto the lake in the winter a mile or more. They would go out skating. So that's pretty fascinating. Then when you look at picture 3, I don't know that everybody can see on the bottom, this was a postcard that my grandmother had. It says County Road near Munising. So the reason I put this in is it really shows how rural Munising was and how isolated it was. And it was so isolated that it wasn't on the main train line. So the main train lines that came up from the Straits and from lower Michigan stopped at a place called Munising Junction, which was several miles outside of town. And then there was a separate, very small train line that took people from there into Munising. Now, the reason this is important is this played a huge part in the flu epidemic not coming to Munising as quickly as it did to other places, because when the flu started getting bad, they could trace it spreading across the country along the railroad lines. Oh dear, my daughter just texted me, sorry. That was really important and kept the community safe longer than some other places. So Lisa, we're ready for the next slide.
All right, hang on.
All right, so this is a picture of my grandmother when she graduated from college. So this was when she was 22 years old. This is exactly when she came to Munising. This is what she would have looked like. And Lisa in a minute here is going to play a recording I found. Now, this ship is the Chief Wawatam, which is featured in the beginning of the book. And if you've read the book, you'll remember this was the ship that functioned as a railroad ferry to take railroad cars across the Straits to St. Ignace. And I actually found the sound of the horn.
Let's try it again.
I didn't. I'm not hearing it, Lisa. I don't know if other people can.
Oh, hang on. I heard it.
Oh, good. Well, if you heard it.
Did anyone else? We'll see. If you can hear it, we'll put it in the chat.
Oh, okay. There is a whole community built around this boat. This boat was beloved by Michigan. It's been completely dismantled in the 80s, and they've saved the steam engine. And there's a whole movement to get this steam engine put into a museum and saved. So I was really thrilled when I heard this horn sound, because this is exactly the sound that my grandmother would have heard as she was crossing the Straits. So Lucile arrived in Munising on or around August 18th in 1918. From the newspaper, I was able to determine that the first day of school that year was August 26th. She was offered $120 a month to be a teacher. Now what happened is, I think high school teachers, especially back then, were primarily men. And most of the men were at war. And so all of the schools had to scramble to get replacement teachers for their high schools especially. And so she was recruited from Albion College to come up to Munising. Now that $120 a month was quite a large salary for back then. I think they were paying a lot of money to entice people to come up there. Again, I think the mills provided a lot of money to the community. And in today's dollars, that would have been $2,068 a month, which was quite a sum for a girl who was leaving home for the first time. In the Munising News on August 16th, the superintendent of schools had the following thing to say. He said, in spite of the shortage of teachers, the Munising School is unusually well supplied with trained teachers for the coming year, and no effort will be spared to make the year a profitable one. Now, of course, they had no idea knowing what was coming. So let's go to the next slide, Lisa. Yeah, there we go. So this is number one, picture number one is Central School. Central School was built in 1907 for the cost of $35,000, which is somewhere in the ballpark of $920,000 in today's dollars. This building was quite large. I don't know if the Mather School is big, but this building was 188 feet long, and then those wings on each side were 74 feet wide. And to me, I was always so surprised how modern this building looked. I think they really built a beautiful school for the community. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in December of 1922 and was replaced on the same site by the current Mather School. And in 1919, the year that my grandma was there were 19 high school graduates, which Lisa confirmed because she had the yearbook by her desk. Picture two is the Beach Inn, which was widely known to be kind of the nicest hotel in town. It was right on Lake Superior. If you look closely, there's a boardwalk, which we will see in other pictures. I assume a wooden boardwalk that went out to the lakeshore. It opened in 1902. At the point that Lucile was there, the cost would have been $1 per day per room. I'm kind of assuming the school district probably paid her room and board. I'm not sure. They only had one bathroom for the whole building, one indoor bathroom. Otherwise, people used chamber pots in their rooms. It had a restaurant and a bar in the back, and there were 2 glass pigs mounted on the bar that people would come in to rub for good luck. So I guess that was a thing to do if you were at the hotel. Now, the big thing about the hotel also was this is where salesmen who were passing through town would stay. It must have been fairly close to the train line. And this drove Lucile's mother crazy. She didn't want Lucile to leave Albion to begin with. There were plenty of teaching jobs that Lucile could have taken in Albion. She wanted to leave home. And so the one request that her mother made was do not play cards. And Lucile wrote in her writings that she loved to play cribbage and 500 with the salesman in the lobby at the Beach Inn. That was her favorite thing to do. So the third picture is great because if you look back at the picture of Central School, you'll see that this is a picture of Lucile right in the doorway on the left side of the door. And this must have been very early on. I think she's trying to look very serious as a new teacher and be taken seriously. And I just love this picture of her in front of the school. We can go to the next slide, Lisa. So Lucile herself wrote that during this period when she came to Munising, all she wanted was an adventure of her own. So at this point, her fiance had left for the war and was headed overseas. I think that my grandmother was not content to sit at home and just wait for him. And I think this was really unusual for women back in the day. And I don't know that a lot of women would have ventured. It was about a 24-hour train ride from home. I think it certainly helped her that she had her friend Vera with her. This is one of my favorite pictures of my grandmother, of all the pictures, not just of her in Munising. She's smiling, she looks happy, she looks excited. She was looking for an adventure. I think she, found it. And then, of course, Lisa, the next frame, the flu hit. So let me tell you a little bit about the flu. There were 3 waves to this flu epidemic. The first one occurred in the spring of 1918, primarily March through June. And the flu was mostly seen in the army camps. So this was right after the United States had gotten involved in World War I, and they were gearing up and sending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of American troops overseas as quickly as they could. So these army camps were just packed with men. And so the flu that occurred there went unnoticed because, number one, you're expecting communicable diseases in these crowded conditions. No one was surprised, that there was a cold or flu going on. At that point, influenza was not reportable. No one thought it was serious enough to have to keep track of or to report. And back then also, they didn't have a system for data collection set up. So no one was paying any attention to this. That wave of the pandemic also was only bad for about 2 weeks. So it happened quickly. It was mostly in the army camps and nobody took notice. Now the second wave, which is the most serious wave, began in August of 1918. It started in Boston, again in the military camps. And this wave spread nationwide in 4 to 5 weeks. And this is what I was talking about before, where it spread out along the train lines. And it went, on the next slide, we'll see it didn't show up in Munising that quickly, again, because Munising was protected by that smaller train line. They weren't on the main train line. So September 28th was an important date in the flu epidemic because that's when the fourth Liberty Loan Drive began. So these Liberty Loan Drives were when the government sold bonds and there was a lot of propaganda. I put a poster up there for victory, buy more bonds, fourth Liberty Loan. To be patriotic, it was expected that you would save your money, you would go to the bank, you would buy as many bonds as you could. And then later on, of course, you got your money back when you turned them in after, I think it was 30 years. So the loan drive kind of famously spread the influenza all across the country. And this was certainly also the case in Munising because the first mention of influenza in the newspaper was October 11th, which is about 2 weeks after the loan drive. Now, in the book, I did something a little different just to make it a little more literary, but my grandmother reported in the stuff that she wrote that the flu came to Munising by a man that was visiting from St. Ignace, that he came in from St. Ignace and somehow they were able to determine that that was the person who brought it to the town. A week later, on October 18th, the disease is presently in Munising. This was the part of the headline. And then 4 days later, the mayor and the superintendent of schools closed the schools. Now this is really important, and we'll see in the next slide in just a minute, other schools weren't closed. So Munising was very ahead of everybody else, saw the need, saw the value in it, and they closed their schools. This is when they paired the teachers off in daily patrols. Which I think was a brilliant idea. I put this line in the book that, these were the people that everybody in the community trusted. So to send these young women in that people knew, they trusted them, they were going to be able to see what was going on. And the idea was that they were to report back if there was any illness in the community. And then the Freuble School building was converted into the base hospital because the idea was they wanted to keep the influenza out of the actual hospital. This was also the same time, if you've read the book, where Lucile found out that her fiance was injured overseas and she did not know if he was dead or alive. So there was a lot coming together for her at this point. So the next slide, please, Lisa. So this, for me, is kind of the photo that really sparked my interest and got me so interested in writing this book. This is an actual picture of Lucile. She's the woman on the right. The woman on her left, to the best of my knowledge, is Vera Smith, who was the fellow teacher that came with her from Albion. This is the boardwalk I referenced earlier that was in front of the Beach Inn. So they're standing in front of the Beach Inn, facing the building with their back to Munising Bay. And this must have been as they were preparing to head out on one of their daily patrols. The teachers had their routes and they did the routes every single day. They were visiting in the homes. On the right, my grandmother had the wherewithal to save her Red Cross armband, which you can see in the photo, and one of her gauze masks. So that is an actual gauze mask from the epidemic. I also have one of the nurses' hats that she wore when she was working at the hospital, but I just couldn't get that to photograph very well. So let me give you a few more facts about the epidemic while we're on this slide. October 24th was when it really started up in Munising. 12 cases of influenza were reported. And on October 25th, the governor of Michigan closed all places of public recreation. So we're talking churches, theaters, pool rooms, dance halls, probably saloons. They instituted, for the businesses, they limited how many people could be in the businesses at one time. I think a reference my grandmother made was 5. There could be 5 people in there. So you would, just like today, you would start seeing lines outside. You would see a limited number of people actually in the stores. But again, even with this October 25th closing, the governor did not mandate school closings. So schools in other places remained open, and the schools in Munising had already been closed. When you look back and read about this time, there was a huge wave of volunteerism, primarily with women. And they said that they think it was perhaps a byproduct of the war spirit. At this point, the war had been going on for a year or two. People were having meatless days and wheatless days, and they were growing victory gardens, and everybody was doing things to support the war effort. And so it was kind of a natural progression, I think, for people to jump in and help with the flu. Now, interestingly, there were very few nurses in the country because a lot of them were overseas helping with the war. And the nurses that were here were not volunteering to help with the epidemic. Now, the only thing, the way I've sort of made sense of that is they maybe had more of an idea to be scared. Grandmother stepped up and helped take care of people. So let's go to the next slide. This is from the 1025 Munising News. This is one of my favorite things that I found in the paper. It was a bulletin provided by Dr. Schultes. He was the health officer. He's a pretty big character in the book. And it's listing off all of these ways to prevent influenza. Now, of course, with what we're going through now ourselves, a lot of these are very familiar. Wash your hands. Back then, they were saying things like sleep with your windows open in all weather. Warmth is necessary, be well clothed. And my favorite two, especially the longer this goes on for us, are at the bottom. Don't worry and don't get excited. So this was advice that they were publishing in the paper. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so November, look at the date here, November 1st. This was literally 102 years ago today, yesterday. So this was exactly what was going on 102 years ago. This is the headline: drastic action, only chance. Plague has only started. So they were really realizing that this was becoming serious. So I put some of my favorite quotes, which I wanted to share with you. These are from G.R. Hill, who was the Michigan State Board of Health. And he came to Munising and met with the physicians and city officials on the 29th of October at the Beach Inn. So he said, don't wait until your funeral car is in daily use and friends and loved ones are being borne to their rest, and then send out the emergency call for relief. So they wanted people to take this seriously and stay on top of it. Incoming trains should be watched and all suspects picked up and examined. A man who expectorates on the streets or sneezes or coughs in public without protecting others by the use of his handkerchief should be arrested forthwith, for that man is worse than a murderer. And then safety first at any cost. So they were really working very hard to get people to take this seriously. And you really can see the desperation that they had. And I think a big part of it was, I think a common response to this was, it's just the flu. What's the big deal? You know, the flu back then was a common illness. It wasn't a particularly deadly illness when it wasn't this epidemic. And so I think it was very hard to get people to take it seriously. Next slide. City in danger, flu spreading. So this was a week later, November 8th. This was again on the front page. The direct cause of the spread of the disease can be directly attributed to two causes: lack of enforced restrictions, and lack of a proper realization of the extreme danger of this communicable disease on the part of the people as a whole. So this sounds familiar to us now with what we're going through. The other quote that was interesting, disabuse your mind if you have concluded that the danger period has passed. So it was really starting to get serious at this point. So next slide, please. So this is very interesting. As is often the case, these things start being reflected in children's play. And so there was a jump rope song at the time that I found a recording of that people would have heard as they were walking around on the streets of Munising. So Lisa's going to play that for us.
Yeah, I'm going to see if we can get this working.
Okay. Do you think it was playing?
Were you able to hear it?
I didn't hear it.
Okay, nobody else can hear. I'm not sure what's going on with that then. We're going to see if we can.
Okay, we can try to come back or.
Yeah, it works. It works fine on my end. So we're gonna try it one more time.
Okay.
Because we changed it from the other one, so that we couldn't hear.
Yeah.
No?
Well, I couldn't hear it.
Okay, we'll try it again later.
Okay, well, if you can go back to that, I put the words in too. So it's this rhyming song that the kids wrong way. That the kids were singing as they jump rope. I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and in and so this was something that would have been heard on the streets as you were walking around and the kids were off school. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so here we are at the peak of the second wave in Munising. Occurred on or around the 15th of November. Warning issued by the state board, flu cases on the increase. Peak of the second wave in Munising, 16 new cases in 1 week. They had 18 cases at the emergency hospital, so at Froebel School. And they pointed out in the paper that this was a conservative estimate and that there were certainly no less than 50 cases in the city, probably more. And in the paper, they said the inspection of homes by the school teachers has been largely instrumental for the success along this line. They're talking about identifying cases and should be continued. Now, this would have been the point at which Lucile was recruited and or volunteered to be a nurse. And she did a week-long stint at the Froebel School. And this would have been when that happened. Now, the flu was getting really bad all around Munising. There were 93 deaths in nearby Newberry, which only had a population of 2,000. And at this point down in Lower Michigan, Petoskey had been quarantined. The whole city had been quarantined and was cut off from anybody coming in or out. So it was getting very, very serious. Next slide. All right. The conclusion of the epidemic in Munising. Now, after that November 15th, things improved steadily to the point where they decided they were going to reopen the schools on December 9th. Now, because the flu was still so bad all around Munising, they decided to keep the schools closed, and they announced that in the Munising News on December 6th. So let me give you some of these figures because it really is pretty startling. Around Munising, well, in Munising alone, I found yesterday, Lisa, I didn't share this with you before, in October, there were 9 total deaths. They don't say what were due to flu or not, but in October, there were 9 deaths in Alger County, 6 deaths in November, and 7 deaths in December. Now compare that to, there were 79 deaths in October in, is it Luce County?
Yes. In
Luce County. Only 1 death was referenced in the Munising News. So in all of the newspapers, there was only 1 death mentioned. It was on December 13th. And again, this was to the bans, to what the mayor did, what the doctors did, what they did to take care of the community. So thanks to those bans, the deaths from influenza and pneumonia in Alger County between October 1918 and April 1919 actually went down 8%. So I think that's the most interesting statistic that tells you how successful they were in keeping their community safe. Marquette County, for that same period, deaths went up 17%. In Delta County, they went up 16%. In Schoolcraft County, these are all the counties surrounding Alger County, it went up 34%. And in Luce County, where Newberry was, it went up 74%. At this same time, there were 300 cases in Gwynn and Princeton, which is over toward Marquette, and they'd had 5 deaths. And there were 383 cases reported in Marquette at this point, with 21 deaths. So even though Munising was doing well, everybody around them, it was still terrible. So they decided to stay closed, which obviously was the right thing to do. They did develop a vaccine across the whole country, and the vaccine was available in Munising, and it was distributed, and it was very popular, and it did absolutely nothing. They just did not understand viruses enough back then, and it was ineffective. And this other final statistic, in this time period in the United States from September 15th to December 15th, so a 3-month period during the peak of the second wave, 300 to 350,000 people died across the United States. So it was very, very serious and very, very deadly. The third wave started in the spring. It hit Munising on April 18th, 1919. Again, this was revealed in the newspaper. And for those of you who read the book, this was the exact same day that Howard, Lucile's fiance, was discharged from the Army. Now, he was back in Michigan at this point, so he was down in Albion, Michigan, and he left home within an hour to get on a train and to come to Munising. So if we go to the last slide, Lisa, or the next slide. This was their reunion. So they spent 5 days together in Munising. I don't know if you can read the photo at the bottom. My grandmother wrote the family, Doties. So my grandmother is the second one in from the right, next to the gentleman in the dark coat. Lisa and I were not able to figure out who all of these people are. The gentleman on the far right is Lucile's fiance, Howard. It appears that that is Munising Bay in the background. They're standing in front of a car, which I assume was the Doty's car. They were one of the first families to have an automobile. And then the picture on the left was obviously taken the same day because Lucile is in the same outfit. And that's the two of them posing for their picture together. So they were reunited in Munising. Howard went back to Albion, and Lucile stayed in Munising till the end of the school year. So that brings us to the end of my presentation, and we can start looking at questions or take questions.
Okay. I'm going to look at the chat here. Other than thank you, Jolene, I'm going to try your hint on what to do for sound. But if you have questions, anyone with questions, you can put them in the chat. I see that a couple people messaged me privately. I can't hear the sound there. But if you have questions, we can go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, you know, we can open it up a few at a time for questions. I just, with this many people, it's hard to do a lot of open questions. Yvonne Robbins is asking what happened to the Froebel School building, and I don't know, do you have that in your notes?
I think that it was razed. I'm remembering it was razed in torn down in 1925 or 1926. Mm-hmm. And there are tennis courts there now, Lisa?
There's tennis courts in the tot lot.
Yeah, and I think the Froebel School was one of the original schools built in the city, and they kept closing it, and then they kept reopening it to use it. Lisa told me they used it after Central School burned as well. And then it sounds like after they built Mather School, they tore it down. Was Charlie actually, did Charlie actually work at the Beach Inn? Is that the question?
I see that from Paula, yeah.
Yes, I'm glad you asked, and that brings me to another point that I forgot to talk about at the beginning. There are two prominent characters in the book that are not real, and Charlie is one of them. So Charlie was not real, and he was completely fictional, and I needed them to have like a buddy at the inn that they could talk to and check in with when they arrived. So no, he was not an actual person. And the other one was Thomas Gardner, the love interest. He was not a real person. Now, there was a reference, however, in one of the letters that my grandmother saved from her fiance. There was a reference to a male friend that she had, and that it was okay with Howard that she had friends that were male. And so I'm not saying that I think anything really happened romantically, but it gave me the idea of, oh, you know, she was encountering other young men, her fiance was off at war, you know, and that gave me the idea, at least, that she would have been friendly with some males in the city. The other thing I want to say about this is, when I did the research, obviously I found everybody's real name in the newspaper. And as I wrote the book, I kept the real names in it just to help myself keep track of the characters, to lay out the story, and not confuse myself. I originally tried to have the book professionally published, and I knew that if it got published by a publishing house, they would probably, for legal reasons, make me change the names. And so I was prepared to change the names, and I spent a lot of time thinking about whether I wanted to do that. And when I ended up self-publishing, it was completely up to me, and I decided to leave them the same, with the hope that that would feel good to all of you in Munising, and wouldn't, you know, especially if any of you are related to any of these folks. But when I saw their story and the great things they did to keep the community safe, I really wanted them to have credit for the great work they did to keep everyone safe and to keep the death toll so low. So that's why I decided to leave all the names in. Is there a reason why I chose his name? No, I don't remember how I came up with his name. Oh, Lisa, do you know?
I assume that Dr. Schultes was, yes.
Interesting.
I'm not sure, you know, I mean, I would assume that was Joy, right? Was her name Joy or Joyce? Joy Schultes was the gym teacher. I don't know, was it her father? She was my gym teacher. Was it her grandfather?
Probably her grandfather.
Okay, Tina's shaking her head. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to see if I can get a way to unmute some folks here shortly. We're going to just kind of unmute, and if you have something that you can add to this, my skills are, you know, they're okay with this. So hang on just a minute, and we'll figure out how to unmute people. That didn't work. If you can go, there we go. If you can go to your own screen and—
Lisa, can
Yes.
you hear me?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, Lisa, the Schulteses live.
Whoops, we lost you, Tina. We know that the Schulteses lived up on Munising Avenue. Pretty much everybody knows Doc's place across from the Dairy Queen. The Schultes, Schaffstalls, that family.
Mary,
You're back, Tina.
Sue Schaffstall was a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So was Alice Mary, who taught school.
Yes.
And Ted there was another, Catherine. Anyway, the Schulteses were good friends of my grandparents. They only lived 2 doors apart. The Doties, I think, lived across the, no, not across the street.
No, the Doties lived in Chartier's house right down by you.
Oh, okay. That was the Doty house. Anyway, yeah, I recognized all the names. And Dr. Schultes was a highly respected physician. And he was highly respected in the community. And I think, you know, that's Diane Verda's grandfather.
Well, that makes sense because I think he was a big part of making those decisions to keep things safe and to be conservative with closing the schools and putting the restrictions on the businesses. Just like today, the businesses were very unhappy back then about the limits on, you know, the number of people they could have in, or if they were forced to close down, the entertainment places had to close. Of course, the grocery stores and, you know, the essential places stayed open, but had the limit of the number of people. But so he maybe wasn't a very popular guy, but at that time, but he made some important decisions that certainly saved lives.
He's our Dr. Fauci.
Yes.
Yes.
Your very own, your very own.
Pam has a question wanting to know, was the Doty home the historical center? And you weren't the only one that thought that that might have been the case, because Michael actually thought that at one point too. But no, the Historical Society belonged to the Lobb family. It was built by the Lobb family. And that house was built after the home that Marcus Doty lived in. Marcus Doty lived in the home that is on the opposite corner of that same intersection, and that is the home of the Chartiers. And Mrs. Chartier was an Artaby, was her maiden name. She was raised in that house, and the Artaby family bought that home from Marcus Doty. So, and we did do some research with the censuses and the Sanborn fire maps, just to make sure that we had the correct homes. And Phil Hansen is in here as well, and he actually lives in the home that was Thomas G. Sullivan. So there's a sign out in his yard too. So if you're looking for the Doty home, that is on the intersection of Lynn and Anoda. And Anna says she just wants to say hi to Tina. So
Did any of these folks live on the corner of Elm and Chocolate? That would be the home across from the high school. That was the Hague Old Home.
No.
I used to live there at right next door to the Madigan.
Right.
Yes.
No, we don't have any of them that are living in there, but we could look that up for you at some point.
Yeah, because that was built around 1900, I think. So, okay.
And to answer the question about the mayor's house, the corner that I put in the book was incorrect. The corner that Lisa found at Birch and Chocolate, that's the correct one.
Yeah.
I had a picture of the correct house, which I sent to her, but I had the wrong intersection. So my apologies. I've learned a little bit from this too. In the book, are the letters written by Howard his real letters, and did I expand them? That's a great question. They're 100% real. There were 37 letters, and I think I edited them down to take out some of the boring stuff that wasn't as great for a book. But I did not change anything. I left the misspellings in. I don't think they were misspellings. Like, he kept spelling the word thoughts, Thots. I think that's maybe just the way some people did it back then. So no, those, I didn't expand them. I did edit them and combine some of them to make, each letter as interesting as possible. But those were the real ones. Lucile saved those. And actually that goes to the next question, one of the next questions too, about how I got the idea to write the book. It really literally came from a box of stuff that we found in my grandmother's basement. My grandmother was a pretty, not shy, but just reserved. And I think I always kind of viewed it as, I think she was proud of the life she lived, but she wasn't going to boast or talk about it. So she didn't tell us a lot of these stories firsthand. We found them in the stuff that she wrote. And I think in her mind, the way I've conceived it is, she was just living her life, and she was doing what she needed to do to serve her community, to do what she thought was right, and later to take care of her family, of course. And so I don't think she looked back on this stuff and would have thought of it as extraordinary. She did know enough, though, to write some of this down and to leave it for us, to save the letters, to save the armband, the gauze mask. And my mother literally, my grandmother died in Ohio. We lived in Wisconsin. My mom literally took this box back to the house and discovered it. And she was actually the first one that started putting all of this together. She was at Albion College and trained as a reporter. So she was the one who sort of discovered there might be a story in here. And then she and I were going to write it together. And then she passed away suddenly in 1995. So I took it over on my own at that point. I think that answered all of those. I was telling Lisa, I originally wrote the book in third person and had it all written and was shopping it around, and I had an agent very early on in the process, and then was told I had to rewrite the whole book in first person, which is how it is now, and I think it is better. I was glad I did it, but it's been a many-year process. If I could ask her anything about it, what would you like to know? That is a great question. I think I would really want to know more about her personal experience with going through the epidemic and choosing to work as a nurse at the same was injured, or I think those two things together must have been pretty unbearable. And so I would want to know more, I think, how she got through that part of it. And for those of you, I'm probably, the spoiler alert if you haven't read the book, but I really truly believe that what helped her get through the experience later in life when Howard did die was her experiences in Munising. I really believe that at my core, that having this experience with the epidemic, stepping in, risking her life, taking those kinds of chances really gave her the strength and gave her the knowledge that she was strong enough to deal with what happened later in her life. That's a great question, thank you. Great question. The question is, how long did Lucile remain in Munising, and did she ever revisit? She just stayed for the rest of the school year. And I don't know if she ever went back. I have no evidence that she went back. She never spoke of it. She didn't write about that. So I don't know. My guess is she did not. But she was just in Munising the rest of that year. She was so set on not teaching in Albion. I think she truly wanted to get away from her mother, as many young women do. She took, the next year, she took another teaching job in Dowagiac in Lower Michigan. So again, her mother could not get her to stay in Albion. She took another teaching position away from home. And then during that teaching position was when she got married and she moved to Chicago with Howard. So she never went back to Albion either. Feel free to just ask questions too.
You can just unmute and ask a question if you have one.
So was that teaching job in Munising only a one-year assignment originally?
Yes, yes, it was just for the school year. The schools stayed closed until after the holidays, and they came back very early in January. They eliminated that part of the break, and they started back like on January 2nd or something. And I think they probably eliminated what would have been like a spring break, and they just worked through the rest of the year. And then she returned home.
And was she a high school teacher?
She was a high school teacher there.
Math.
She taught mathematics. Yeah. Now, after the accident where she had to become the breadwinner, she had to go. She initially worked as a county worker during the Depression as a social worker, which I find interesting because I'm a social worker. So there's a little bit of a connection there. So she did that for several years. And then the problem was she had to go back to school to take 1 or 2 more classes to get her teaching certificate in Ohio. She had a Michigan teaching certificate, but that wouldn't transfer to Ohio. So she had to come up with a way to have her children taken care of for an entire summer. And she had to go to one of the universities in Ohio and take these classes all at once over the summer to get her teaching certificate. So that's what she ended up doing with that. And then she taught junior high the rest of her life. Do I have plans to write another book? Yes, I'm in the process of writing another book. It's kind of the polar opposite of this one. It is not, well, not polar opposite. It's a personal memoir from my own life. It's a little historical in that it's a period piece. It's putting together a bunch of stories from the 1970s. My family went to a resort in northern Minnesota every summer, and there were lots of characters there, lots of interesting stories. So it's going to be a memoir based around this resort in the very early stages. But thank you for asking. Philip, yes, Philip reached out to me through the website and lives in Mayor Sullivan's house. Oh, and you attended Albion as well. And had a cat in Munising named Lucy. Perfect. Philip, you've just become the #1 fan of the book. That's great. Yeah, Mayor Sullivan's house was very important because that's when they were quarantined. And this was another reason that I wanted to share the stories of the people in Munising. I told Lisa, as much as my grandmother, did her part to help out, people in Munising took care of her between the Doties, who she lived with after she came back in January. And then Mayor Sullivan, I mean, can you imagine? He's the mayor, he's dealing with an epidemic in his city, and he agrees to quarantine himself at his home. So he had to be quarantined for a week himself and run the city from his house. And his sister Stella was there. And my grandmother did write several sentences about her time with the Sullivans and said that they had a grand time. So that's why I put in there that they drank a little wine and they had the Swedish massage person come over. And, I don't know if those things truly happened, but they had a grand time. So I think they were taking care of themselves in there.
Does anyone know? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Okay, this is my first Zoom ever, so this is historic in itself.
Good for you.
Was the Sullivan family related to, if anyone knows, Isabella Sullivan, who was very involved with the Historical Society?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Isabella was married to Thomas's son because her home sits directly behind, and it was like the same lot.
Correct.
Her home was on Birch Street, behind.
That's true, Lisa.
And was the house, Lisa, Stella's house or Thomas's house? Do we know?
The one, well, I know that when I did my research at the county, at the Register of Deeds, that when the home was sold to Dr. Ruggles, it was deeded by Stella.
Interesting.
So, at some point, Stella owned the home. So I'm not sure if that was because Thomas had passed away, if it was jointly owned or whatever, but I didn't have time to get that far into it. Philip kept telling me to go to the Register of Deeds, but I didn't have time. So I called up there and I got that information.
Well, you found an incredible amount of information. It's amazing. If you guys are interested in this history stuff, I absolutely highly recommend going in and working with Lisa to look at the Munising News digitally. There is amazing stuff in there, and I literally found all of this in the newspapers.
It's a lot easier to do now.
It's a lot easier
than
to
you
do.
did it. What we did though, too, to identify what some of the locations that we weren't really quite sure was we took ancestry.com literally and looked for these people in the census, in ancestry, and you can see what street they lived on. And then we used the fire maps from the Library of Congress, and those maps were done of Munising in I think the earliest one was like 1896 when they actually mapped some of the first original buildings in town for fire reasons, for insurance companies, to kind of know where the buildings were and what they were next to, and so they mapped out cities all over. And so we used the Sanborn fire maps because you could see buildings, and then the neighborhoods that were closest to downtown, you could count the houses and figure out. So that's how we did it. So wait, Jamie's got another question though.
Yes, I see that. Thanks, Jamie. A Far Different Path, I'll read it to everybody. A Far Different Path was published just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, just over 100 years after the 1918 pandemic. Are there any lessons you learned while researching your grandmother's story that you think readers could learn from? Well, absolutely. I mean, I think some of that was in the slides that I shared with all of you, and I think it's in the history of Munising. You know, they took it seriously. They did what they needed to do to keep people safe, even though some of the decisions they had to make weren't popular. People were giving them a hard time about masks. They were giving them a hard time about the closures. You know, but clearly with an 8% reduction in deaths during the largest, you know, pandemic of the century, they did something right. So, you know, I think that's what I take from it. And another thing I took from it was my grandmother's willingness to step up and help. Now, not everybody needs to step up, and I mean, you couldn't today. Can you imagine them letting a teacher go in and be a nurse? The world is just so different, but you know, so you don't have to do something that dramatic, but I think there's ways we can all help, whether you're checking on your neighbor, whether you're, you know, donating food to the food bank in town, you know, whatever there is. You know, I did an interview on NPR with Michigan Radio, and if you're interested in listening to it, there's a link to it on the website. And she asked me a question at the end similar to this. And I was thinking, you know, my grandmother had every reason to leave town. You know, she was 22 years old. She was up there by herself. I don't think many people would have batted an eye if she had gone home, at least for the bad part of the pandemic, you know, and then returned when the schools reopened. But she didn't do that. And so, you know, I think there's a lesson in that of doing what you can to help, even if it's not quite that dramatic.
I think I figured out my noise problem.
Oh, okay. Do you want to go back to those slides?
I do want to play that those sounds for you guys. If you want to just hold on 1 second, I am going to go to this PowerPoint and find the slideshow.
Slide 6.
Which one was it? That didn't help. We're going to go back to the
There was
the
first one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't mean to make anybody dizzy, but
Okay.
yeah, apparently there's more to this than what we thought. So hopefully it's not too loud. Hang on 1 second. Well, maybe not. I can hear it, but very, very faintly. So
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, I can't. That's an epic fail.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Sorry. Okay, are we still here?
Yeah.
I actually rode on a train ferry
Did
across
you?
the straits
Did you?
in about 1950.
Really? What was that like?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
The train goes right onto the ferry, and I was visiting my aunt down in Detroit and needed to get back home in time to go to school.
Sure.
I had ridden back with her because she didn't like to drive alone. She taught down in Detroit and had been home for most of the summer.
Uh-huh.
And so I rode back with her. And I think I was in 8th grade at the time. So that would have made it about 1950 or 51.
Yeah.
51. And
They must
so
have been.
she put me on the train at about 10 o'clock at night. And I had a berth, and she gave the conductor a great lecture on how I was all by myself and
I bet.
he better look after me. And then we got to the straits, and I rode most of the time outside looking out, but I was so afraid that the train would get off
Without you. Sure.
that I went back in pretty quick. And
Well,
then I rode the train as far as Wetmore.
Okay. Well, that
where
might have.
Where my dad picked me up.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That might have been the Chief Wawatam because it was still in service then.
It probably was.
It probably was.
I don't think there was more than one.
Mm-mm. No, I don't think so. That's very interesting. Those ships must have been massive to be able to take those trains.
Yeah, they were pretty big.
Yeah, I bet.
Were there any other questions? Did anyone have anything else? Feel free to unmute, or any comments. Now, like I said, the Pandemic History Walk will be up through the 10th. So we do have a survey, and we'd love for you to fill out the survey. I was so excited about the prospect of getting the community to read this book and take a look at not only what happened then, but what's happening now. I mean, it just, what are the chances, you know what I'm saying? And so as part of my participation in a leadership group through the University of Michigan, I had the opportunity to do something a little special. So the funding that I received from that is what we're using for the Pandemic History Walk. And so any kind of feedback about how being in those places and seeing the images, for those of you who can go on the walk, any feedback that you can give us for that would be very, very much appreciated. Like I said, 2 signs end up in the bay. We will replace them as soon as we can get them printed. So, but yes, I strongly encourage you to self-guide while you socially distance and get a little fresh air.
I'm currently, Lisa?
Yes?
I'm currently sorting my grandmother's letters.
Are you?
Only mine aren't that old. Mine are from the 40s and the 50s. They were the letters she wrote to my Aunt Elmer. But I don't think I'm going to find any wonderful story in them. I'm just trying to get them in some sort of order.
You never know.
My siblings and my cousins, well, I remember those times pretty well. And there were, although she still had family in Germany, so there was that.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to say, you know, for all of us who might have an experience like Michael, where you come across something from an older relative, letter writing is a lost art.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, I really doubt that he's going to stumble across a cache of emails. You know? Yeah,
and be moved to write a book.
Yeah, so, you know, during that time, letter writing was a record, and people did save the letters. So if you do have, you know, it's kind of a treasure to be able to read those things.
My grandmother wrote to my Aunt Elle on the average of 2 or 3 times every week.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I would be curious to hear from all of you if the letters were a nice part of the story from the reader's perspective, because when I did shop this book around to agents, one of the things that they didn't like was the letters. And I was very resistant to taking those out precisely for the reason Lisa said, you know, letter writing like that is a lost art. And I mean, they were beautifully written. They told another part of the story, and I thought they were important, but I'm curious how you guys felt about them.
I think it's too bad she didn't save some of the letters from her mother.
Oh, there you go. That would have been
It would
interesting.
have given another slant to the story.
That's true. That's true.
So I'm going to share the 2 signs that that went astray.
Oh, good.
We can see them and you guys can get an idea. And each sign has a map. The map is also available on the website, on the library website. So the first one I'm going to share here is the one from the First National Bank. Can everyone see that?
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, so basically I gave a couple of views that were from around the time of the bank, that would have been, you know, the time that Lucile was there. And each one has a kind of a blurb from the book, as well as, you know, a few things that I thought were pertinent to the particular building or site that we were at. And one of those things that I thought was kind of interesting is down in the bottom corner, we had an image of a $20 bill that literally was from the First National Bank of Alger County at Munising. And that image to me was priceless. That came to us from the Holzman collection of photographs, a digital photograph collection that a patron of ours, he digitized all of the things that he owned, postcards and other items. And one of the things that he had purchased was one of those bills. The front page of the Munising News from the time of the bonds being pulled is added to the sign. And remember, these signs are the size of like a real estate sign, so they're kind of easy to read. But I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit more. That there's also an advertisement for Dr. Schultes, who had his office upstairs of the First National Bank building. And then I included, if you can see, the poster for the war bond sale, and like I said, a little blurb from the book, from Michael's book, talking about when they went to buy the bonds. This building survived 3 fires.
Wow.
One of them, when the Munising News was housed in here for a long time, one of them in the 1930s was quite devastating. And I do have some photos, but I didn't have enough room on the thing to add it in there. But it was started and fell through. The Munising News was actually printed in the basement.
Wow.
And so a lot of the Munising newspapers were damaged in the fire. And you can see that kind of a little bit when you look at this newspaper image, that it was charred around the edges and trimmed, where they cut, you know, it was bound in a book, and they cut the edges off so that you could, you know, so they could keep the paper without it having all the burnt edges on it.
Wow.
And so I'm going to stop this share, and then the next one I'm going to show you is the Beach Inn. And this one obviously is floating in the bay somewhere.
Oh, that's a great picture.
Isn't that a wonderful picture?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a postcard down on the left that is also from the Holzman collection. And it's absolutely beautiful, colorized from the 1930s. And I thought it was great. But the one on the very bottom is a view of the beach inn from what was the city dock.
Mhm.
And you can see that it was all wood. And you can actually see the train depot in here as well. So this is kind of a neat picture, I thought, the one on the bottom.
So Lisa, the train depot was across the street from the hotel, which explains the salesman.
Yes, the
Awesome.
train depot was across the street.
Yeah.
So I'm moving it around, but up in the upper left-hand corner is actually the beach inn drawing from the Sanborn fire map at the Library of Congress. And I was able to zoom in on that. So it shows what the floor layout was on the main floor, where there was the parlor, an office that separated the dining room area, and then the kitchen off the back wing. So, and it actually told how it was heated, and that had electric lights and whatnot. And then 2 fire escapes, 1 on each side. So I just thought that these were some pretty unique pictures.
Yeah.
But this is actually right at the beginning of the park, because I didn't really want it to be hidden by the buildings or whatnot. So when you first go down to the park, it'll be right there. But everybody pretty much knows that, you know, the beach inn sits where Pictured Rocks Cruises is now. So, but this is what the most of the panels look like. Each one is different. And the last thing I was going to show you is, if in case anybody has not seen the map shows downtown, and the different locations are with a letter, and each letter is shown over in the key, so you can see you know, a little bit of information about what you're looking at. We did tuck number C, our letter C, the Victory Arch, is kind of, Philip gave me permission to tuck it into the window well at the old Huntington Bank, so that it kind of, because there isn't really anywhere to stick it in the ground, it is in that one window well there. So did anybody have any questions about that aspect of it?
Did you say that all the pictures will be on the library website for the pandemic walk?
Eventually we will put them on our Facebook once the pandemic walk is over.
Over? Okay. Because
onto our
I would
Facebook.
love to be able, I'd love to see that. Unfortunately, I won't be up there before.
So, and we'll make a provision for folks just like you, so you can be able to share it as well. So, and Jamie has thank you to us. Oh, very nice. I've been looking.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, Jamie has a pretty long history in Munising as well. So I think Jamie, maybe you and Michael can have a chat about how to write that family history.
Sure.
I love the letters, and I'm happy to hear they were real. Spoiler alert, I cried when Charlie died, but even harder when Howard did. It is a really great story.
Oh.
How old was your mother, Michael, when Howard died?
She was in kindergarten. She was 5 years old.
She was, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then the youngest was my Uncle Dick, who is still alive.
And he was only 3. Two?
He was two or three, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That
was a wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It was really nice to be able to talk to you. Munising was, and I'm sure still is, an amazing place, but there's a tremendous amount of history for such a small town, too. A lot of interesting things went on there, I think.
I think so, too. Well, Michael, we certainly appreciate you coming and joining us. We would love to have you come back sometime in person, because everybody would love to meet with you and some autographed books. I do have 5 of the autographed copies that Michael has, and so I will be compiling a listing of everybody that registered for this, and we'll be doing a drawing, and we will contact you via email to let you know if you're a winner.
Wonderful.
Great.
So great.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Thank
Have a
you
good
so
evening.
much. Hello
Thank
to
you.
my
Stay
cousin.
safe.
Hello to my sister Nicole and my cousin Cindy, and is Connie in there too? I'm not sure. I think I saw her. Just wanted to give a shout out to some family.
This was wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
And
you.
everybody stay safe.
So
Yes,
You guys
yes,
too.
please. Yeah.
Yes.
very
I
good.
love the history of our community.
It's really great. Really great. It was
It is.
nice getting to learn it and to know the people.
How old was your mother when she passed, Michael?
She was only 69 years old.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, yeah. She'd been
That's
a lifelong smoker, and
Mm.
it caught up with her, unfortunately.
Oh,
Yeah, I've thought about her and my grandmother. They both would have been thrilled, but especially my mother would have been absolutely thrilled to see the book and to know I'm talking to everyone in Munising and that there's a walk about the book. She would have just been thrilled. So
yeah.
really great to be able to share it with you all. Thank you.
Well, when you come back in better times, we'll do the walk.
I would love that. I would
Everybody
love
here,
Let
will
us know.
Yeah.
watch for
that. Okay.
that.
Yeah, that would be
Wonderful.
great.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank
If
you
you can-
everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Lisa,
Thank
for
you.
organizing this.
Oh, no
Yes,
problem.
Lisa. Thank you.
It's great.
My pleasure.
Good night.
Okay. Bye,
Good night.
everybody.
Night.
Good night.